This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you!
Boring. 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 Boring.
You got it work. Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. That's exactly what you're doing. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
Good day to you, Lembit Öpik here on Lembit Öpik Live on Unprecedented TV, the home of free speech. But for how much longer? I ask that question because it seems to me that the United Kingdom is now locked in a predicted battle between those of us who believe in free speech and those who think that free speech is something you can trade away for other benefits. I am, of course, referring to the increasing storm between the Labour government in the United Kingdom and Grok, and more specifically Elon Musk, who runs X, which controls Grok. What is Grok? It's an AI system, artificial intelligence system, that does things. It can tidy up your picture. It can change your picture. It can dress you, and apparently it can undress you. And this is where the problem lies. Apparently some unscrupulous people have created naked images of individuals using the Grok artificial intelligence program. Of course, Grok isn't the only AI system, and lots of other ones could do the same thing. But for some reason, which I'll discuss with my guest, it seems that once again, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos may or may not agree, by the way, he's going to be my guest, that somebody like Elon Musk is the victim of the ire and bile and anger and wokery of those people. It's better to censor than to engage. Why do I say that? Well, I'd like to think that all of us, including even people who aren't that keen on AI, would agree that there's no argument, no defense in creating offensive images of people that are personally very embarrassing. I think that, at least I hope, that if somebody created a naked image of somebody, which was a fake piece of news, you would regard that as wrong. I certainly would. But that's not what we're really debating here. We're debating about whether Grok and X should be banned in this country, whether there should be sanctions, whether X can self-regulate as it does at the moment, or whether it needs the heavy hand of British administration to tell it what it can and cannot publish. And herein lies the problem. If you go down that path, who is the censor? What's allowed and what is not allowed? Are you allowed to defend Iran in a very tense situation there? What about if you criticize Israel? How about taking a pro-Russian stance? Would any of those be acceptable in a situation where the current Labour government is in charge and has a very clear view about what's acceptable and what is not? Remember that this government has put people into prison, such as Lucy Connolly, for hurty words on the internet, words that she almost immediately retracted and regretted. But alas, it was too late. And for one reason and another, she ended up spending over 1 year languishing in prison. I've never thought of Lucy Connolly as a threat to the public. Perhaps I felt slightly differently about Councillor Ricky Jones, who coincidentally was a Labour councillor who called on an audience to slit the throats of right-wingers and get rid of them all. He walked free, having pleaded not guilty. So we find ourselves in a difficult situation. Somebody is going to tell us what is acceptable and what is not, because somebody already does. There's the infamous case, and we shall return to this in the show today, of a lady engaged in silent prayer outside an abortion clinic, which was closed, and she was arrested for what amounts to a thought crime. What is therefore happening to the United Kingdom, a country which has gone to war to defend freedoms? Do we have freedom in this country? Are we allowed to think for ourselves? Or are those very thoughts a crime, in rather the way that George Orwell suggested in his seminal book, 1984? Well, joining me now is somebody who always speaks his mind. It's Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus, good to see you. I hope I haven't been overly dramatic in my introduction.
Not at all, Lembit. These are diabolical times in Britain and in other Western countries, such as Australia and Canada. So far from being melodramatic, you've actually hit the nail on the head.
It was kind of you to say so. Let's start with the big picture here. The person at the center of the scandal is Elon Musk and X. They've got this software program called Grok, which I have to say I'm not very familiar with. I think it probably gives me advice from time to time without me realizing it. Are you clear what Grok is?
My understanding of Grok is that you can ask it a question, for example, about a date in history, and it will go across the internet looking for an answer. And that is about that amounts to my knowledge of Grok.
Okay, it's little better than mine. I suspect it might even be worse, Marcus, because I think it can actually do more than that. I think the issue here is you can tell Grok to take someone's clothes off, and it does. I'm not sure if it's actually complete nakedness. I haven't actually looked at the images, I have to say. But certainly it seems to me that the great ire, the great anger here is because some people have been using this software to reimagine presumably famous people. I'm not sure if it's famous people, not famous people, and therefore cause the perception of offense or perhaps embarrassment. Now, before we go into the rights and wrongs of this, surely we all understand that with the introduction of artificial intelligence, which doesn't or shouldn't be taking a moral stance, surely, it'll do what it's told. And just as a knife can be used to butter bread or kill a person, the software itself isn't really guilty, is it?
Per se, no, not at all. But Grok is not the issue. The British state is looking for a pretext to ensure that British people do not have an outlet where they can see the other side to the story when it comes to domestic affairs in Britain or when it comes to international affairs. The British state is a tyrannical one. For some years now, Lembit, I have said that Britain is a tyranny and a kleptocracy, but Britain is certainly not a democracy. And some people responded with bewilderment. Some people accused me of being unpatriotic. I responded to them, as I will say now, by saying this: tyranny comes in different shapes and forms. There are overt tyrannies, such as Saudi Arabia and North Korea. Then there are clever tyrannies, which masquerade as democracies, but in reality, they are a tyranny. So, John Milton, the great English poet and thinker, defined tyranny as the following: when a king or a government does not act in the interests of the people. When that happens, a country or a kingdom is no longer a democracy, but is instead a tyranny. So, for example, it was not in the interests of the British people for the British state to flood Britain with millions of legal and illegal immigrants. It was not in the interests of the British people for British history to be trampled on. It is not in the interests of the British people for their cultural and spiritual identity to be eroded. It is not in the interests of the British people for billions of pounds of their taxpayers' money to be sent to foreign governments. The list goes on and on. So people must understand what tyranny actually means. And they then must understand what democracy actually means. Once they acquire the answers to both of those, then they will conclude, and only conclude, that Britain is a tyranny.
You mentioned John Milton. He goes back a long way, and there he is, in fact. And John Milton was a philosopher. You could also have mentioned John Stuart Mill, who always talked about liberty. I've studied him at some length at university. But these people are historical characters. What would you say to those who say, well, Milton and John Stuart Mill couldn't have foreseen the internet or the ability of a machine to redraw the image of a person? It's interesting. They always talk about women, but it could be anybody, actually. The image of a person in a way which is defamatory, embarrassing, or offensive.
Well, first of all, if the British state is sincerely committed to defending women and children, then why is it allowing tens of thousands of men of military age to enter the UK illegally, to be settled in towns across the UK without being vetted? Why is the British state allowing men who have been convicted of, for example, raping a woman, to be allowed to be set free from court, either because they don't speak English or because of dietary requirements? So
Okay.
that is a question that needs to be put to them. And if the British state is really interested, is committed to tackling paedophilia, then why doesn't it introduce severe punishments for paedophiles, such as the death penalty?
Quite strong. The whole new debate there about capital punishment. Also, the response that people would say is not every, in fact, probably majority of people who come here, even illegally, probably don't commit a crime. I haven't got statistics for that. It would probably be very hard to find them. But just before we go into the direction of going, because we're talking about migration and we're talking about contradictions there. When you look at, for mentioned John Milton and so forth, the argument always, and you get that from people like Louise Haig, who in my view is a very intellectually challenged politician, there she is, who thinks that the online safety bill and all that, it's all really good. I heard her say, if you're watching this live, I heard her say on the mainstream media today how fantastic it was to have the online safety bill. These people think that the solution to problems is censorship. And the question I've got for you is, perhaps tying into the contradictions, why do we have politicians who, rather than tackling the underlying issues of, for example, prejudice and discrimination, and incidentally violence against people, not just women and girls, violence against people, lots of men and boys suffer abuse, instead of doing that, they just censor things? That doesn't stop the person who created the image in the first place thinking the way they do. Is it just because these cack-handed fourth division politicians, my opinion, don't understand the true nature of education and an age of reason?
The British state censors anything which goes against its official narrative. No different to how, if you have a different opinion on Russia, you are depicted as a Russian propagandist or a Putin apologist. If you have a different opinion on, for example, Srebrenica in July of 1995, you are depicted as a genocide denier. If you have a different opinion on, for example, immigration and multiculturalism, you are depicted as racist, as fascist, as far right. So that's the background story that each and every one of us must take into consideration when we listen to the British state's argument about banning X. Furthermore, it is no coincidence that on X, people are allowed to express opinions, which you will never find in British mainstream media, be it Sky News or BBC News or the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail or the Guardian, and so on and so on. The British state will find any pretext whatsoever to act. And the pretext now is grok. I don't think that's particularly clever, what the British state is doing. In fact, it's very obvious. The British state is aware that millions upon millions of Britons have turned away from British mainstream media and are now learning the truth about what is happening in Britain and in the wider world on platforms such as X. And that is why the British state has now turned its attention to X. This is about stifling opinions. This is about cementing the tyranny that Britain is.
You're watching me, Lembit Öpik, with Dr Marcus Papadopoulos as we talk about the threat to your free speech in the United Kingdom and across the world as well. The argument so far that there is a concerted effort to suppress your right to say things. I'm adding to that. Doesn't stop you thinking them. But do we have thought crimes in this country as well? We'll come to that after a short break. Somebody who will never be silenced is Claire Dyer. Dire Consequences is her show, and her dedication is to find local issues and find the national interest in that as well. That's Claire Dyer. Watch this. That's Claire Dyer, fantastic woman, very brave, fighting the good fight, often on demonstrations, and definitely a campaigner for free speech, as is my guest today, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. The story so far, we're talking about free speech and as much as it exists in this country, and we're talking about it in the context of the threats to well, I say grok, but it's really to X, where I feel, this is my opinion, Marcus, that the wokerati, the Labour government and so on, they don't like X because they can't control it.
Yes, I agree, but I wouldn't categorize this as the Labour government seeking to destroy what remains of free speech in Britain. No, because the same occurred under the Conservatives. This is the British state, or the British ruling elite, or however you wish to describe the dark forces which rule, not govern, rule the United Kingdom. What we have at Westminster is a uni-party. Fundamentally, they all say the same thing when it comes to domestic affairs, when it comes to international affairs. If the Conservatives were to form the government tomorrow, they would continue the same agenda. So this is the British ruling elite attempting to eradicate what remains of free speech. And as you mentioned moments ago, Lembit, there are now thought crimes in the UK. Thought crimes, something which many people decades ago would never have imagined would occur in Britain, but it has happened. They are occurring on a regular basis. And it just goes to show how quickly a country can descend into tyranny.
Let's look at one of those thought crimes. A lady was arrested for silent prayer outside an abortion clinic, which wasn't at that time functioning. Watch this.
Physically, I'm just standing here.
Okay. Why here of all places? I know you don't live nearby.
But this is an abortion centre.
Okay, that's why you're stood. Is you standing here part of the protest?
No, I'm not protesting.
Are you praying?
I might be praying in my head.
So I'll ask you once more, will you voluntarily come with us now to the police station for me to ask you some questions about today and other days where there are allegations that you've broken public spaces protection?
If I've got a choice, then no.
Okay, well then you're under arrest on suspicion of failing to comply with the Public Spaces Protection Order, which is under the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014. Now, of course, you do not have to say anything. It may harm your defence if you do not mention one question, something which you later on in court, anything you do say may be given evidence. Do you understand the caution?
I do.
That's unbelievable. Unbelievable. The woman, it was quite quiet, but the woman has basically been asked what she was praying about, and she was arrested. She was taken into custody. Police actually had to pay compensation at one point, but she got arrested again. What do you make of that, Marcus? And what do you think George Orwell would make of it?
Well, it is completely disgusting, and it is unforgivable. And I truly mean unforgivable. However, we need to see the bigger picture. The British police today in 2026 is a political police force. It is not independent. It is not impartial. No one is seriously going to argue that the British police today is not a political one, because it clearly is. Indeed, so many people, vast amounts of people in other countries, in all four corners of the world, have observed the same observation about the British police. And the British police should be aware of something. They should be aware of the judgment at the Nuremberg trials, because a police officer today in Britain can say, well, I'm just obeying orders. No, that is no defense in international law. That is no defense in British law, because the judges at the Nuremberg trials, which included a British judge, said that obeying orders is no defense. So these police officers who are arresting people like that poor woman for simply praying are complicit in crimes against humanity. There is no defense. Obeying orders is no defense in law. Furthermore, the British state has gone to war against Christianity. The British state loathes Christianity. The British state fears Christianity. Why? Because the British state has gone to war against the British people. And the fundamental pillar of the British national identity is Christianity. And that is why they are relentlessly attacking Christianity. So that's the bigger picture.
Not when you think about Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister. He's an atheist, proud to be an atheist as far as I can see, which means he believes in absolutely nothing, in my opinion. In my view, that means that he is he's detrimental to the state. I would tend to agree with you on that. But returning to the point you're making there, and I'm acutely aware of the time, but I don't want to open up a huge, long debate. But George Orwell wrote the seminal book 1984, which is incredibly depressing because it's coming to pass now. And in that, you had thought crimes and you had doublethink, when you could think two contradictory things at once. At the beginning of the show today, you were highlighting the fact that politicians do one thing and say another. Classic example would be during the COVID lockdowns, where we were told how serious COVID was, could be deadly disease, could wipe us out. But there were parties going on in Downing Street, and prime ministers, former and current prime ministers, broke the rules. I mean, it's unbelievable. And then they say they forgot, or, oh, there's a special extenuating circumstance. That was a business meeting. Oh, that means that the virus couldn't run around in the room because it was a business meeting. It seems to me, Marcus, that we are now living in the 1984 environment, and the very things that Britain lost a large number of people defending in wars are being eroded because, to quote a famous phrase from the early 1900s. We have seen the enemy and he is us.
Well, first of all, during the lockdowns, if COVID-19 was as deadly as the British state claimed, then its representatives, such as politicians and journalists, would not have been mingling with one another. Secondly, anyone who was complicit in the lockdowns is complicit in one of the worst crimes against humanity in contemporary times. And let us never, ever forget what the British state did to the British people. The lockdowns were illegal. They were a crime against humanity. In regard to George Orwell, yes, I think, Lembit, many people now, because of what I call the COVID catalyst, are now aware of George Orwell, but they should also become aware of Aldous Huxley and his book, Brave New World, which was published in the 1930s. They should also become aware of John Milton, as I mentioned earlier, also John Stuart Mill, as you mentioned, also John Locke. If people want to understand what democracy, what freedom, what civil liberties, what tyranny truly is, then they must become familiar with the works of the aforementioned people. Because unfortunately today, Lembit, the concept of civil liberties is regarded by a great many people as being a dirty one. And I can understand that. But civil liberties is a concept which has been appropriated, distorted, and wielded as a weapon by the British state against the British people. When the British state talks about civil liberties, it's talking about clamping down on people's opinions. But civil liberties per se is absolutely fundamental to democracy and freedom. So people must not turn on civil liberties. People must understand that civil liberties are absolutely essential. Civil liberties mean, for example, free speech. Civil liberties, when spoken by useful idiots in the House of Commons or by useful idiots in mainstream media, means a completely different thing.
There is one politician from the United States, there is Donald Trump, who's overtly criticized the United Kingdom for lack of civil liberties, as has his deputy, that's the American Vice President, J.D. Vance. Now, one of the things that worries me is this quote: censorship of ordinary Britons was increasingly routine, often targeted at political speech. Do you know why that quote worries me, Marcus? I'll tell you why. Because I can't tell if that's what Donald Trump said or if that's what George Orwell said. I suspect it comes from 1984. But that's where we are. And then you have that gormless fool, in my opinion, Keir Starmer, saying that civil liberties exist in Britain and will for a long time, while his own government has gone a long, long way to undermining them. Is this, first of all, what do you make of Donald Trump's comments? And I think that is an Orwell, I could be wrong, that could be an Orwell quote, but what do you think of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's criticisms of Britain?
The words of Trump and Vance are, of course, completely legitimate and completely accurate. People in Britain, even those who realize something there is something terribly wrong occurring in the UK, are still not quite familiar enough with what free speech is. And a lot of British people, regrettably, but not surprisingly, have become conditioned to not saying certain things. Words. We're not talking about actions. We're talking about words, mere words. So yes, the Trump administration understands very well that there is not much free speech left in the United Kingdom. And quite frankly, if the British state goes ahead and bans X, then I sincerely hope, for the sake of the British people, that the American government will sanction the British state. They will sanction key individuals in the British state, for example, the leadership of Ofcom, because then and only then could the British people have a chance of surviving this onslaught. Because other than that, I am not seeing evidence, Lembit, that the British people are prepared now to fight back. Yes, they have woken up. Yes, they are speaking far more freely than they ever did before, but it's still not enough. If X is banned, then that will be one of the last nails in the coffin of the British people's ability to speak freely. It cannot be allowed to happen. It must not be allowed to happen. And again, the American government, by sanctioning the British state, will be a wonderful thing for the British people and a wonderful thing for democracy as a whole.
Thank you so much. That's Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. A good place to finish there. I echo Marcus's thoughts. It's quite simple to me. If you allow this to happen, as Mike Moz says on the chat, why do we need censorship? Yeah, well, because governments are too frightened to let you think for yourself. And if we allow censorship to continue, we're simply saying our politicians are too stupid to win debates, therefore they shut them down. And when it comes to Grok and AI, in my opinion, this isn't a war against Elon Musk. That to an extent, it's politically motivated, in my view. This is a war against AI. It's a war against a tool which on its own has no moral agency, but which can be used for good or harm, just as a knife can, just as a box of matches can, just as a gallon of petrol can, to power you on your journey or to burn down someone's property. I think what we're seeing here is a failure of democracy so deep that totalitarians are now using their capacity to oppress in preference to their limited capacity to debate. I'm sure that you as a sensible person wouldn't endorse embarrassing, offensive and hugely hurtful images, which perhaps your children can see, or you yourself could find hugely upsetting. But the double standards that Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos reveals there and highlights are deep-seated in this country. And to those who say we must cancel X, I say, well, then why don't you cancel all the newspapers which have done incalculable damage to individuals, including to myself, on the basis of false, offensive, and utterly insensitive reporting? I discovered that my former partner had lost our child on the front page of a newspaper. That not harm me. I hope that the people who want to cancel X will also turn their back on that entire media group, but I very much doubt they will.
Immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages.